Before we begin, I'd just like to say thank you for being here and to let you know how you can get in touch with the show. If you'd like to share your thoughts on this episode, suggest a case, or request a shout out, you can find What They Hide Hidden Crimes in Plain Sight on social media. You can follow and message the podcast on X and Blue Sky. Just search at What They Hide Pod on both. You can also email the show directly, whattheyhidepod@gmail.com. The details will be in the episode description. I read every message and I really appreciate you taking the time to reach out. Okay, let's crack on with the show. In a hospital ward in Chester, there is a room where time moves differently. It doesn't follow the clock on the wall, it follows oxygen levels, heart rates, breath counts measured in seconds. Inside incubators the size of office desks lie babies who arrive too soon, skin almost translucent, hands no bigger than a thumb, ribs visible beneath fragile chests, rising and falling with mechanical help. Their parents sit beside them in plastic chairs, watching, waiting, praying for numbers to stay stable. Because in this room, survival is measured in grams and minutes. In 2015, something began to go wrong in this room. Babies who had been stable suddenly collapsed, without warning, without clear explanation. A dissaturation here, a cardiac arrest there, a child who had been improving, deteriorating within minutes. Doctors resuscitated, nurses responded, machines beeped louder. Sometimes the babies survived, sometimes they didn't. At first it was tragedy. Neonatal medicine lives beside tragedy. Premature infants are fragile. Outcomes can change in seconds. But over time, patterns began to whisper. Consultants on the neonatal unit started comparing notes. The collapses were unexpected. Some were unusual. A few were, in their words, unexplained, and one name kept appearing on the rota: Lucy Letby. Lucy Letby was a neonatal nurse. By all outward accounts, she was diligent, hard-working, trusted. She had trained at the University of Chester. She had worked on the unit for years. She cared for the hospital's smallest patients, the ones who needed constant attention. Colleagues described her as committed. Parents trusted her with their babies. She sent sympathy cards when infants died. She stayed late. She volunteered for extra shifts. There was nothing, at least on the surface, that marked her as dangerous. Nothing that resembled a monster. Then the deaths continued. Between June 2015 and June 2016, a number of babies died or suffered serious collapses on the unit. Consultants began reviewing cases. They examined blood gases, x-rays, medication logs, shift patterns, and slowly, cautiously, suspicion formed. Not certainty, suspicion. In 2017, Lucy Letby was arrested. In 2023, after one of the longest and most complex criminal trials in modern British history, a jury convicted her of murdering 7 babies and attempting to murder others. She was sentenced to a whole life order. The judge described her actions as a cruel, calculated campaign of child murder. The law is clear. Lucy Letby is guilty. Her convictions stand. And yet, outside the courtroom, the conversation has not ended. Some statisticians have questioned the interpretation of the data. Some medical commentators have debated the clinical conclusions. Some observers have asked whether clustering proves causation. Others insist the evidence was overwhelming. This is not a story about conspiracy. It's not a story about overturning a verdict. It's a story about certainty, about how we reach it and how sure we should be before we say the word monster. Because in the neonatal unit in Chester, something terrible happened. That much is undeniable. The question, the one that lingers, is this. Did a nurse murder the most vulnerable patients in her care? Or did tragedy, statistics, and suspicion converge into something far more complicated? Tonight we step inside the ward, inside the courtroom, inside the doubt. This is what they hide. Hidden crimes in plain sight. And this is the Lucy Letby case. This episode contains discussion of infant death, medical trauma, and allegations of murder within a hospital setting. Some listeners may find the themes distressing. Listener discretion is strongly advised. The Countess of Chester Hospital sits on the edge of a historic cathedral city in northwest England. It is not a large teaching hospital. It does not dominate headlines. It serves its community. Routine surgeries, emergency admissions, maternity care. And on one floor in 2015, there was a neonatal unit, a place built for babies born too soon. The unit cared for premature and vulnerable newborns. Some weighed little more than a bag of sugar. Some needed breathing support. Some needed feeding tubes, IV lines, constant observation. Parents would sit for hours beside incubators, watching tiny chests rise and fall. Every number on a monitor mattered. Oxygen saturation, heart rate, blood pressure. A small dip could mean everything. Neonatal medicine lives close to crisis, but it always lives close to hope. And in 2015, hope and crisis began colliding more often than anyone expected. Before she became a headline, before she became a courtroom sketch, Lucy Letby was a neonatal nurse. She was born in 1990, grew up in Hereford, an only child. By all accounts, she had a conventional upbringing, supportive parents, stable home, no documented history of violence, no criminal record, no dramatic ruptures in her past. She trained at the University of Chester, qualifying as a nurse in 2011, and she chose neonates. That detail matters. Neonatal nursing is not accidental. It's not a fallback speciality. It is highly technical, emotionally intense and demanding. You care for babies who weigh less than a kilogram. You calculate drug dosages in micrograms. You monitor oxygen saturation percentages that fluctuate in seconds. Mistakes are catastrophic. By the time she joined the Countess of Chester Hospital's neonatal unit as a qualified nurse, she had completed placements and additional training. Over the years, she progressed to caring for higher dependency babies. Colleagues described her as competent. Some described her as enthusiastic, willing to take on shifts, willing to stay late. In photographs shown during the trial, she appeared as many nurses do: scrubs, hair tied back, ID badge clipped at chest level. Nothing outwardly sinister, nothing theatrical, just a young professional in a demanding job. Outside the hospital, her life appeared modest and ordinary. She purchased a small 3-bedroom home in Chester in her mid-20s, a milestone many celebrate. She had friends from work, nights out, social media posts, birthday gatherings. No one testified to seeing an explosive temper. No evidence was presented of prior aggression. In court, the prosecution did not argue a long history of violence. They argued something different, that the harm began in 2015, which raises a profound psychological question. If she is guilty, then something shifted, and if she's not, then something else did. But in 2015, none of that was visible. In neonatal care, nurses often become anchors for patients. Doctors move between units, consultants rotate, nurses stay. They teach parents how to hold premature babies without dislodging tubes. They explain monitors. They sit through 3 a.m. alarms. Several parents later told the court that Lucy Letby had appeared caring, compassionate. One described her as kind. Another recalled her offering reassurance during frightening moments. It is important to sit with that, because the prosecution later argued that presence was manipulation. The defence argued it was professionalism. And from the outside, those two interpretations can look identical. There is also something else about neonatal nursing that complicates this story. When a baby deteriorates, nurses are often the first to respond. They call doctors, they begin resuscitation, they are present in crisis. So when collapses occur, nurses will almost always be there. That fact is neutral. But later in court it became central. Presence would become evidence, routine would become pattern, and pattern would become narrative. There is no public record of Lucy Letby expressing violent fantasies before 2015. No diaries filled with malice, no documented disciplinary history. The handwritten notes that would later shock a courtroom were written after she had been removed from the ward, during investigation, not before the alleged crimes began. That timing matters, because if you're trying to understand how a nurse could become a serial killer, you search for rupture. If you're trying to understand how a nurse could be wrongly accused, you search for pressure. In 2015, the neonatal unit was under strain. Staffing pressures were documented. The Royal College later identified governance concerns. This does not prove innocence. It does not prove guilt. It establishes environment. An environment shapes interpretation. When police arrested Lucy Letby in July 2018, neighbours described shock. She was not known as volatile, not known as unstable. She lived quietly. And here is the unsettling truth. Most convicted healthcare serial killers have appeared ordinary. Harold Shipman appeared ordinary. Beverly Allitt appeared ordinary. So ordinariness proves nothing, but neither does it prove guilt. That is the tension. Between 2015 and 2023, Lucy Letby transformed in the public imagination from nurse to suspect, to defendant, to convicted child killer. The law recognises the final stage. But as we step back into 2015, into that ward, she is not yet any of those things. She is a nurse on shift, logging observations, administering feeds, adjusting oxygen, and somewhere between routine and catastrophe, the narrative begins. If she is guilty, then what happened inside that ward was a betrayal of profound magnitude. If she is not, then something else happened, something systemic, statistical, interpretive. But in this moment, at the beginning, there is no monster. There is only a nurse, and a unit where babies began to die. In 2015, the neonatal unit was operating at what was classified as a level 2, meaning it could care for babies requiring some intensive support, but not the most extreme cases, typically handled by major tertiary centres. The unit had staffing pressures like many NHS wards, but it functioned until the summer. In June 2015, a baby known in court as Child A collapsed and died unexpectedly. The baby had been born prematurely but was described as stable before the sudden deterioration. Less than 24 hours later, Child B, a twin sibling, also collapsed but survived. These events unsettled staff. Unexpected collapses happen in neonatal medicine, but 2 in such proximity raised concern. Later that month, Child C died after collapsing suddenly. Doctors began reviewing the cases more closely. Were these natural complications or prematurity, or something else? At the time, there was no formal accusation, only unease. By the end of 2015 and into 2016, further collapses and deaths occurred. In total, between June 2015 and June 2016, 7 babies later named in court as murder victims died, and others experienced serious collapses that formed the basis of attempted murder charges. During the trial, prosecutors argued that the pattern was not random, but in 2015, it did not look like a criminal investigation. It looked like a ward under stress. In most hospitals, death on a neonatal unit are devastating, but not unheard of. Premature infants can deteriorate quickly. Sepsis can overwhelm fragile immune systems. Lungs can fail. Heart rhythms can destabilize without warning. Doctors are trained to expect unpredictability. But by the summer of 2015, something felt different at the Countess of Chester Hospital. It wasn't one dramatic moment, it was accumulation. After the deaths of babies A and C in June 2015, consultants began reviewing the cases. These were not inexperienced clinicians, they were senior doctors, neonatologists with years of exposure to fragile outcomes. They examined blood gases, reviewed ventilation logs, discussed timelines. In isolation, each case could be explained as tragic complication, but together, the collapses felt unusual. Unexpected deterioration in babies who had appeared stable, rapid crashes without clear preceding infection, resuscitations that felt atypical, and then something else, a name that appeared repeatedly on the rota. One consultant began plotting incidents against staff schedules. It was not an accusation, it was a question. Who was present? The pattern emerged quietly. Letby had been on duty during each of the deaths in 2015. This observation did not immediately become criminal suspicion. It became discomfort. Because accusing a nurse, a colleague, is not a small step. It threatens careers. It destabilizes teams. It risks being wrong. In early 2016, further incidents occurred. More sudden collapses, more cases without clear medical explanation. Consultants began documenting concerns more formally. Emails were sent to hospital executives. Meetings were held. The tone sharpened. One consultant later testified that by February 2016, he believed the deaths were not natural. Another described feeling that if action was not taken, more babies could die. But hospital management did not immediately agree. Executives questioned whether there was sufficient evidence. Were the doctors misinterpreting tragic but natural events? Was the unit simply under pressure? Were staffing levels contributing? Hospitals operate under layers of governance. You cannot remove a nurse from duty lightly. And at this stage, the evidence was circumstantial, pattern-based, not forensic. There is a moment in any investigation where suspicion crosses into belief. According to court testimony, the moment came for several consultants in mid-2016. They described feeling a sense of dread when Letby was on shift. They described reviewing cases and concluding that medical explanations no longer satisfied them. But here is what makes this section so crucial. Belief is not proof. Consultants are clinicians, not detectives. They were interpreting medical outcomes. Their interpretation was sincere, but interpretation can differ. The prosecution would later argue that the consultant's growing certainty was evidence of pattern. Critics later asked whether the consultant's certainty shaped how subsequent cases were understood. That distinction between pattern leading to suspicion, shaping pattern, is subtle but enormous. The tension between consultants and hospital leadership became strained. In court, it was revealed that consultants pressed repeatedly for Letby to be removed from clinical duties. Management hesitated. There were discussions about medication, about restoring working relationships. At one point, Letby was reportedly asked to apologise to consultants for the stress caused by the situation. That detail is striking because it illustrates how uncertain things still were. This was not yet a criminal investigation. It was a workplace dispute layered over tragedy. Only later, with hindsight, does it appear ominous. In real time, it was confusion. In July 2016, Lucy Letby was removed from frontline clinical duties. She was reassigned to administrative work, not charged, not arrested, removed pending review. Consultants described relief. Management described precaution. Letby later described feeling devastated and unfairly targeted. All three of those emotional states can coexist. Relief, precaution, devastation, and none of them prove guilt. The hospital requested an external review by the Royal College of Paediatrics and Child Health. The review identified issues in governance and staffing. It did not determine criminal wrongdoing, but it acknowledged strain within the unit. That's important because the consultants' concerns were unfolding within a system already under pressure, and when systems strain, interpretation becomes harder. Eventually, consultants insisted police involvement was necessary. This is the point where suspicion crosses institutional boundary. Calling the police about a colleague is not routine. It is extraordinary. It signals that internal explanation has failed. Operation Hummingbird was launched in May 2017. From that moment forward, the narrative left the ward. It entered criminal law, but it began here, with doctors in a room, looking at charts, feeling something was wrong, and deciding they could not ignore it. There is something profoundly human about this section of the story. Doctors trying to protect patients, executives trying to protect process, a nurse at the centre saying she had done nothing wrong. No villain speech, no dramatic confrontation, just unease that hardened into accusation. And in that transformation from discomfort to belief, lies one of the most delicate questions in this case. When does suspicion become certainty? While investigators worked, parents of the affected babies were living with unimaginable loss. Funerals had already taken place, nursery rooms left unused, birthdays passed without children. The case was not just statistical, it was deeply human, and by the time charges were formally brought in November 2020, the allegations were staggering. 7 counts of murder, multiple counts of attempted murder. The accused, a neonatal nurse who had once been trusted to protect the smallest lives in her care. In court, prosecutors would later argue that the collapses were not natural. They alleged methods including air embolism and insulin poisoning, but in 2015 and 2016, none of that was publicly known. There were only deaths and suspicion. Suspicion inside a hospital is complicated. Medicine deals with life and death every day. When outcomes worsen, explanations are sought in infection control, staffing levels, clinical practice. To accuse a nurse of deliberate harm is not a small step. It is a rupture. And yet by mid-2016 that rupture had begun. Consultants believed there was a link. Hospital leadership hesitated. Police eventually became involved. From there, the story left the ward and entered the criminal justice system. By the time the trial began in October 2022 at Manchester Crown Court, nearly 7 years had passed since the first death. The prosecution would present a case built on medical interpretation, insulin test results, handwritten notes found at Letby's home, and statistical presence during collapses. The defence would argue the deaths were the result of natural causes, prematurity and systemic failures, not murder. But all of that comes later. With a ward, with fragile lives, with doctors uncertain, with a nurse removed from duty, and with a question that had not yet been answered. Were these tragic medical outcomes, or the early signs of something criminal? In medicine, patterns can save lives, but patterns can also mislead. And before we step into the courtroom, we need to understand exactly what the jury was shown, because the prosecution's case was not built on rumour. It was built on specific claims, medical claims, statistical claims, and words written in ink. We'll talk more about that in a minute. By the time the trial began, in October 2022 at Manchester Crown Court, the events on the neonatal unit were no longer internal hospital concerns. There were allegations of murder. Lucy Letby stood in the dock, charged with killing 7 babies and attempting to kill others between June 2015 and June 2016. She pleaded not guilty to all charges. The prosecution's case unfolded over months. It was not built on eyewitness testimony. It was not built on CCTV footage. It was built on medicine, statistics, documents, and pattern. The prosecution argued that Lucy Letby deliberately harmed babies in her care using various methods, including injecting air into the bloodstream, injecting air into the stomach via feeding tubes, administering insulin to babies who had not been prescribed it, interfering with breathing support. They did not argue a single method repeated identically. They argued a nurse who adapted, a nurse who in their words gaslighted colleagues into believing collapse was natural. And the most powerful pillars of the prosecution's case was what they described as a clear pattern. Lucy Letby was present for each of the deaths for which she was convicted. She was also present for many of the serious collapses forming the basis of attempted murder charges. The prosecution presented rota charts to the jury, coloured grids, dates, names, shifts. They showed that when the incidents were plotted chronologically, Letby was on duty each time. The argument was simple. The only common denominator across the events was her. The defence would later argue that this was circular reasoning, that once suspicion fell on Letby, incidents were examined through that lens. But right now, we stay with the prosecution, because to understand the verdict, you must understand how compelling this looked inside a courtroom. Several babies were alleged to have suffered harm consistent with air embolism, air injected into the bloodstream. Medical experts called by prosecution testified that certain symptoms, sudden collapse, skin discoloration, mottling patterns, were consistent with air being introduced intravenously. In some cases, X-rays were said to show unusual air patterns in major blood vessels. The prosecution alleged that Letby had injected air into intravenous lines. Air embolism is rare. It is also difficult to detect definitively after death. But the prosecution's experts testified that the pattern of collapses and symptoms was consistent with deliberate air injection. The defence disputed this interpretation, but the jury heard detailed expert testimony supporting the allegation. Perhaps the most concrete scientific evidence presented involved insulin. In 2 cases, babies were found to have extremely high levels of insulin in their blood. Crucially, laboratory results showed low levels of C-peptide. In simple terms, when the body produces insulin naturally, it also produces C-peptide. When insulin is introduced artificially, C-peptide does not rise. The lab results showed high insulin, low C-peptide. The prosecution argued this could only be explained by synthetic insulin being administered. These babies had not been prescribed insulin. The prosecution presented this as clear evidence of deliberate poisoning. No insulin vial was found. No one saw insulin being administered. But the blood results were central. The jury was told this was not something that happens by accident. When police searched Lucy Letby's home in 2018, they found handwritten notes on post-it notes and diary pages where phrases including "I am evil," "I did this," and "I killed them on purpose because I'm not good enough," and then "I don't deserve to live." The prosecution presented these notes as admissions. They argued they reflected guilt. The defence argued the opposite. They said notes were written during a period of extreme mental distress after Letby had been removed from the unit while under investigation and struggling psychologically. They argued the words reflected self-blame and anxiety, not confession, but the prosecution returned to them repeatedly. They were powerful because they were written in her handwriting, and they contained the words, "I did this." The jury also heard that Letby had searched for parents of some of the babies on Facebook, sometimes months after the babies had died. The prosecution suggested this reflected a continuing interest in the families of her victims. The defence argued it was morbid curiosity or simply a human response to tragedy. But again, the searches added weight, pattern, interest, presence. The prosecution alleged that Letby sometimes inserted herself into grieving families' experiences, offering sympathy, taking photographs, sending condolence cards. They argued she derived attention from the aftermath of tragedy. They suggested she manipulated colleagues by appearing helpful and concerned. It was a psychological framing, not just a medical one. The prosecution painted a portrait of a nurse who thrived on crisis, who positioned herself at the centre of emergencies, who stayed calm while others panicked. The defence would reject that portrayal entirely, but to the jury, the image was stark. Several senior consultants testified that by 2016 they had become convinced that the deaths were not natural. They described reviewing cases and finding no adequate medical explanation. They described raising concerns with hospital management. They described frustration that stronger action had not been taken sooner. Their testimony carried weight. These were experienced doctors. They were not police officers, they were not journalists, they were clinicians saying something was wrong. While we're focusing on the prosecution's case, it is important to note that each pillar was challenged. Defence counsel suggested alternative medical explanations for collapses. They questioned the reliability of expert interpretations. They suggested staffing issues and systemic failing contributed to poor outcomes. They emphasised the lack of direct evidence. But the prosecution's structure remained intact. Presence, pattern, insulin, air, notes, searches. It was cumulative. No single piece stood alone. Together the prosecution argued they formed certainty. Parents testified. They described being told their babies were stable, then being called back to find resuscitation in progress. They described final moments. Those testimonies were not forensic, they were human, and in cases involving infants, emotion is unavoidable. The prosecution did not rely on emotion alone, but it lived in the courtroom. After months of evidence and over 100 witnesses, the jury deliberated for weeks. In August 2023, they returned verdicts of guilty on 7 counts of murder and several counts of attempted murder. Lucy Letby was sentenced to a whole life order. The judge described the crimes as a cruel, calculated campaign. The law's position is clear. She is guilty. Her convictions stand. But outside the courtroom, some observers began to ask questions. About statistics, about interpretation, about whether presence equals causation, about whether complex medicine was presented too simply. Those questions do not overturn a verdict, but they exist. And in a moment, we're going to examine them. Because understanding doubt requires first understanding why 12 jurors were convinced, and they were. Manchester Crown Court, October 2022. The public gallery filled early most mornings. Parents sat together, some avoiding eye contact with the dock. Reporters lined benches with notebooks open. Court artists sketched, and at the centre of it all, Lucy Letby sat behind the glass of the dock. Neutral expression, shoulders slightly forward, listening. The trial would last nearly 10 months. It would become one of the longest and most complex murder trials in modern British legal history. Day after day, the jury heard medical evidence. X-rays projected on screens, blood results dissected, charts plotted. Doctors walked through timelines minute by minute. They described sudden desaturations, collapsed lungs, cardiac arrests that did not behave as expected. The prosecution's case was cumulative. It did not hinge on one dramatic moment. It built, slowly, and for jurors the task was enormous. Complex medicine, conflicting expert testimony, emotional testimony from parents, dense legal argument. They were instructed to consider each charge separately, not to assume guilt on one because of another. Each baby's case stood alone, and yet the overarching narrative was impossible to ignore. Pattern, presence, escalation. Lucy Letby chose to give evidence. For several days she sat in the witness box, calm, soft-spoken. She denied harming any baby. She said the collapses were tragic but not criminal. She said she loved her job. When confronted with handwritten notes, "I am evil, I did this," she said they were written during a period of emotional breakdown. She described feeling isolated after being removed from the ward. She described internal investigations and the psychological toll of being suspected. She denied injecting insulin, denied injecting air, denied intending harm. Under cross-examination, the prosecution pressed her on inconsistencies, on why insulin results showed synthetic patterns, on why she searched for parents, on why she wrote those words. It was tense, not theatrical, but heavy. The parents' testimony did not focus on medicine. It focused on moments, a nurse telling them their baby was stable, returning to the ward to find chaos, being asked to leave the room during resuscitation, holding their child for the last time. In some cases, parents described Letby as present during their grief, supportive, comforting. The prosecution framed that presence as manipulation. The defence framed it as professionalism. For jurors, the emotional burden was immense. These were not abstract victims. They were infants whose parents were still in the courtroom. Outside the court, headlines intensified. Britain's most prolific child killer, angel of death, language hardened. Once verdicts began returning, guilty on some counts, deadlock on others, the narrative accelerated. When the final guilty verdicts were delivered in August 2023, the courtroom was silent. Lucy Letby was not present for the sentencing hearing. She chose not to attend. The judge sentenced her to a whole life order. He described her actions as a cruel, calculated campaign. He said she betrayed the trust placed in her as a nurse. The gravity of that sentence cannot be overstated. Whole life imprisonment means no minimum term, no automatic release. It is reserved for the most serious crimes. On the days that followed, public certainty seemed absolute. Political leaders condemned her crimes. The hospital faced scrutiny. Families were interviewed. The case appeared settled. For many, there was no ambiguity. The jury had spoken, the judge had spoken, the law had spoken. And in this case, involving babies, certainty provides emotional closure, or at least the illusion of it. But something else began happening. Not loudly, not on front pages, in academic forums, in statistical circles, in medical commentary. Questions emerged, not accusations of conspiracy, not claims of fabrication, questions about interpretation. Some statisticians began examining the rota charts. They asked, was presence being mistaken for causation? In a small neonatal unit, if a nurse works a high number of shifts, is statistical clustering inevitable? Professor Richard Gill, a statistician known for analysing alleged miscarriages of justice, publicly questioned whether the data supported the conclusions drawn. He did not declare Letby innocent. He questioned whether the statistical case had been robust. Separately, some medical commentators debated the air embolism findings. Were the symptoms described unique to deliberate air injection, or could they occur in premature infants with complex conditions? And the insulin results, while presented as powerful, prompted technical discussion about laboratory reliability and interpretation. None of this overturned the verdict. None of it invalidated the jury's decision. But it introduced something rare in high-profile cases: intellectual discomfort. Here is the tension at the heart of the episode. Inside the courtroom, the prosecution's case was detailed, layered, and persuasive enough to convince 12 jurors beyond reasonable doubt. Outside the courtroom, some experts, not fringe theorists but academics, began saying, "Is it that simple?" Was complex neonatal medicine reduced to criminal narrative? Was clustering interpreted through hindsight? Was the hospital's own systemic failure fully explored? These questions do not accuse, they probe, and in a case of this magnitude, probing matters. As of now, Lucy Letby's convictions stand. Her first appeal was dismissed. The legal system maintains the verdict is safe, and yet debate continues in certain professional circles. That does not make the jury wrong, it does not make the conviction unsafe, but it does make this case different from most, because most cases fade into consensus. This one has not. In a moment we're going to slow this down. We're going to examine the statistics, the medicine, the psychology of pattern recognition, not to overturn, not to accuse, but to ask the question that makes this case so unsettling. When a jury is certain, how certain should the rest of us be? When a jury delivers a verdict after 10 months of evidence, it carries enormous weight. 12 people, hundreds of exhibits, weeks of deliberation. The law says Lucy Letby is guilty, but outside the courtroom another process begins. It is quieter, slower. It happens in academic journals, on specialist blogs, in conversations between statisticians and clinicians. It's not driven by emotion. It's driven by method, and the method asks one question. Was the reasoning sound? The prosecution's most visually compelling evidence was the rota chart. Dates along one axis, staff names along another, incidents marked clearly. Lucy Letby's name appeared at each of the deaths for which she was convicted. To a jury this looks powerful, but statisticians look at something different. They ask, what was her overall shift frequency? If a nurse works more shifts than others, the probability of being present during rare events increases naturally. Professor Richard Gill, a Dutch statistician known for examining alleged miscarriages of justice, publicly argued that the statistical case required careful scrutiny. His concern was not that clustering never matters, it was that clustering by itself can mislead. In small populations, like a neonatal unit with limited staff, random variation can appear dramatic. This is known as the law of small numbers. In small samples, randomness often looks like pattern, and humans are wired to see patterns. There is a concept in statistics called the Texas sharpshooter fallacy. It describes a marksman firing bullets randomly at a barn, then drawing a target round the tightest cluster and declaring accuracy. In other words, selecting data after the fact and interpreting it as intentional pattern. Critics of the Letby case have asked whether incidents were reviewed retrospectively, meaning once suspicion fell on her, cases were re-examined and interpreted through that lens. The prosecution would argue the opposite, that the pattern led to suspicion, not the other way round. But the debate exists, and it matters, because pattern recognition is powerful and dangerous when lives are at stake. The prosecution alleged that some babies were harmed through air embolism, deliberate injection of air into the bloodstream. Medical experts testified that certain symptoms, sudden collapse, skin discoloration, mottling, were consistent with air embolism. But here is the complexity. Air embolism in neonates is rare, and diagnosing it after death is extremely difficult. There is no single definitive post-mortem test. Some critics have argued that symptoms described in court, such as mottled skin or sudden deterioration, can also occur naturally in premature infants experiencing sepsis, lung complications, or cardiovascular instability. The prosecution's experts maintained the patterns were unusual enough to indicate foul play, but medicine is not mathematics. Interpretation matters, and interpretation can differ between experts. The jury accepted the prosecution's interpretation. Some medical commentators remain unconvinced that the evidence was conclusive. That is not the same as saying it was wrong. It is saying it was debated. The insulin cases were perhaps the strongest scientific element presented at trial. 2 babies had extremely high insulin levels with low C-peptide, a pattern consistent with exogenous insulin administration. The prosecution argued this could not happen naturally. The defence did not dispute the lab results existed, but critics have raised questions about laboratory testing methods, chain of custody procedures, whether the tests were validated for forensic certainty, whether contamination or lab anomaly could explain the findings. It is important to say clearly, the jury heard testimony and accepted that insulin had been deliberately administered, but post-trial, some specialists have debated whether the lab analysis was sufficiently robust to eliminate all alternative explanations. This is technical territory. It does not overturn a conviction, but it complicates certainty. Another area of the debate concerns the hospital itself. Before criminal charges were filed, the Countess of Chester Hospital faced scrutiny regarding staffing levels and neonatal care capacity. The Royal College Review in 2017 identified issues including staffing shortages, communication breakdowns, governance concerns. Critics have asked, could systemic strain contribute to higher than expected mortality? Were underlying structural problems sufficiently examined before criminal conclusions solidified? The prosecution argued that natural causes and systemic factors could not explain the specific patterns observed, but the broader context remains relevant. Hospitals are complex ecosystems. Outcomes depend on staffing, resources, training, and escalation procedures. In high-stress environments, tragic clusters can occur. The question is whether this was one. There is a psychological concept called confirmation bias. Once suspicion forms, the mind begins filtering information to support that suspicion. This is not corruption, it is human cognition. Once consultants suspected Lucy Letby, every subsequent collapse may have been viewed through that lens. Supporters of the conviction would argue the suspicion arose because of evidence. Critics ask whether the evidence was interpreted through growing suspicion. This is not an accusation. It is a known investigative risk. In complex cases involving medicine and statistics, interpretation is everything. There was no CCTV footage of insulin being administered, no eyewitness testimony of air injection, no forensic syringe recovered containing proof. The case was circumstantial, but circumstantial does not mean weak. Many convictions rely on circumstantial evidence. The jury believed the accumulation of evidence removed reasonable doubt, but for some observers, the lack of a single direct observable act leaves discomfort. What makes this case so gripping is not just the crime, it's the divide. On one side, a jury, a judge, medical experts, a conviction upheld on appeal. On the other, statisticians questioning clustering, medical commentators debating interpretation, observers wary of pattern-based reasoning. Both sides claim to be grounded in method. Both sides believe they are protecting justice. In cases involving babies, emotion amplifies everything. The public wants clarity, but medicine rarely offers clarity. It offers probability, and probability is not certainty. Lucy Letby may be exactly what the jury concluded, a nurse who deliberately harmed the most vulnerable patients in her care. or this may be a case that future scholars dissect for its complexity. Right now the law is clear, but the debate, measured, technical and uncomfortable, continues. And in the final part of the pod tonight, we confront the hardest question of all. When doubt exists, even if small, what does justice demand? There is something uniquely powerful about a verdict. When a jury stands and says the word guilty, it does more than determine punishment. It creates narrative closure. It tells a society, this is what happened. This is who did it. You can rest now. In the case of Lucy Letby, that closure was immediate and overwhelming. 7 babies murdered, attempts on others, a nurse entrusted with fragile lives. The story seemed clear, but clarity and certainty are not always the same thing. When babies die in hospital wards, there is a psychological vacuum. Parents need answers. Staff need answers. The public needs answers, because randomness is unbearable. The idea that premature infants can deteriorate unpredictably is terrifying, but the idea that someone caused it, that is, in a strange way, stabilizing. If there is a cause, there is control. If there is a perpetrator, there is containment. One of the most uncomfortable truths in human psychology is this: we prefer a villain to chaos. Humans are pattern-seeking creatures. We evolved that way. If berries grow near a certain tree, we remember it. If storms follow certain clouds, we notice. But pattern recognition can betray us. In small data sets, like a neonatal unit with a limited number of staff, clusters can occur by chance. This does not mean the cluster in Chester was chance. It means our brains are predisposed to see significance. In the courtroom, pattern became narrative, and narrative became certainty. Language matters. Once headlines began describing Lucy Letby as Britain's most prolific child killer, the narrative hardened. That phrase alone reshapes perception. It moves the case from complex to monstrous, from debated to settled. Media framing does not determine verdicts. Juries are instructed to ignore it, but public opinion forms quickly, and once public opinion solidifies, doubt becomes uncomfortable, because doubt can feel like betrayal of victims, of families, of justice. 12 jurors listened to months of evidence. They were instructed on the standard beyond reasonable doubt, not beyond all doubt, not mathematical certainty, reasonable doubt. They concluded that threshold had been crossed. That conclusion deserves respect. But the legal threshold and the philosophical threshold are not identical. The law requires proof beyond reasonable doubt. History sometimes demands more. There have been cases before, in the UK and beyond, where medical convictions later collapsed. Cases where statistical reasoning was flawed. Cases where expert testimony was later reinterpreted. This does not mean the Letby case is one of them. It means history teaches caution. Medicine evolves. Statistical literacy evolves, legal standards evolve, and sometimes what felt airtight in one decade feels uncertain in the next. Here is the tension you feel as you listen. On one side, 7 dead babies, grieving parents, a jury verdict, a whole life sentence. On the other, statistical debate, medical disagreement, systemic hospital concerns, absence of direct eyewitness proof. Both realities exist at the same time, and sitting in that tension is uncomfortable. But discomfort is not weakness, it is intellectual honesty. If Lucy Letby is guilty, truly guilty, then the conviction represents justice for vulnerable children and their families. If Lucy Letby were ever proven innocent, a hypothetical that at this moment remains hypothetical, then the consequences would be staggering, not just for her, for trust in medicine, for trust in juries, for trust in the justice system. This is why cases like this grip the public imagination. The stakes are enormous in either direction. What does certainty mean? Is it a jury's verdict? Is it expert consensus? Is it absence of doubt? Or is it simply the point at which society decides it cannot bear uncertainty any longer? Right now, the legal position is unambiguous. Lucy Letby is guilty. Her sentence stands. Her appeals have failed. And yet outside the courtroom, scholars continue to analyse. Doctors continue to debate. Statisticians continue to examine the numbers. Not to sensationalise, but because when medicine, mathematics and criminal law collide, complexity follows. In a neonatal ward in Chester, babies were lost. That is the beginning and the end of what we know with absolute certainty. Everything else, motive, method, interpretation, intent, has been filtered through evidence, argument and judgment. Perhaps the jury was right. Perhaps history will agree. Or perhaps years from now, this case will be revisited in ways we cannot yet see. What makes this story haunting is not just the allegations, it is the fragility of certainty itself. Because justice demands confidence, but truth demands humility. And sometimes, those two demands sit uneasily together. Next time, on What They Hide, we examine another case where authority and narrative collided and ask again, when we say we are sure, how sure are we allowed to be?